RealAg Live. And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. Really do appreciate it. Hope everybody's making out well with harvest today. We got a great show for you here today. We're going to talk all about pulse agronomy. We're really locking in on pulses today. It is going to be a very good show. If you have a question for today's guest, all you got to do is enter it in the comment box, whether you're watching on YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook, or maybe even Twitch. And we'll get to as many of those questions as we possibly can. Yesterday we had questions from across the country, even the Ukraine. But today I'm assuming we're going to be a little bit more locked in on Western Canada and some of the pulse issues that growers are facing. Hey, but if you're growing pulses in Ontario, why not challenge us? We'll take it. We'll do our best for sure. Today's guest, going to bring her in. It is Sherrilyn Phelps. She is the agronomy lead with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. Sherrilyn, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. Hey, so give us a bit of an update here. Where are we at kind of with the pulse harvest right now?
Well, we're actually ahead of the 5-year average in terms of pulse harvest. About 90% of our peas and lentils are off, so that's a good thing. Nice to see those crops getting in the bin. Compared to last year where we were so much more delayed. This year, the hot weather in August really brought things in.
Now, did that hot weather negatively impact us at all?
I think it did. We have fairly good quality right now, and that helped with the dry conditions and bringing things in kind of evenly, and so far fairly good harvest weather. But I think the heat at the end of July and the beginning of August blasted some of those top flowers, particularly in peas. So some of the yield was lost in fields that, I think guys were expecting higher yield. And then when they got in there, they weren't quite as high as what they were expecting. Some of the seeds are a little bit smaller too, just because the plants ran out of moisture. So, there's a little bit of a negative effect, but we'll take good harvest and getting things off in good time above, huge yields and having quality issues.
Yeah, that's true. Like you got to take the good and the bad and kind of balance it all out. And one of the things when I think of pulse crops, I think of plant disease.
Yes.
Yeah. How do we make out this year?
It started off fairly dry, and then we kind of got all those rains in July. And so disease was prevalent, and it was really quite high risk. A lot of fungicides went on. And I think that's one of the pluses when the heat came at the end of July and into August. It really shut down the disease progression, which was nice. So we're seeing a lot of the fields that had disease initially, and disease was starting to kind of ramp up. But when that weather switched, it really helped to keep that under control. So that was a good thing from it.
Yeah, because one of the big concerns, I remember you and I talking, it had to be about a month ago. One of the big concerns was there was there was lots of biomass, specifically in the lentils, and
Yes.
concerns about lack of adversity, what that could mean for the yield of lentils. We heard the same thing from FarmLink on their big tour they did across Western Canada. They had some of the same concerns, questions about the lentil yield. What have you been hearing from growers?
The big biomass definitely was a concern in August when we were getting those rains and really heavy canopies. And there was some problems with anthracnose, definitely in the lentils. But I think that dry conditions, again, in that August and shutting the top off really stressed them out and brought them in more so than we were expecting it to.
Yeah, it's kind of reverse psychology, right? A lot of times we're looking for like ideal conditions, but for the most part, pulse crops really do need that adversity. Why is that?
Oh, that's a good question. Lentils particularly, they almost need that stress. They're an indeterminate crop. So that means as the conditions are good for growing, they will keep growing. So they need that stress to kind of switch them into that, we better make some seed now because conditions aren't favorable. Better get some reproduction happening and produce some seeds. So a lot of our pulses are more indeterminate which is different than the determinate crops. So weather can really play a role, and a lot of times with those indeterminate crops, you need some sort of stress that just triggers them to switch gears and get into the reproductive modes. A lot of the breeding has been with making these varieties that are more determinate, shorter seasons, so that we're trying to get away from needing that extreme stress, but there still is a little bit of stress with some of these that does help to bring them in.
My understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, I always thought it was really the case with chickpeas. Is that true?
Yeah, chickpeas is another one that's fairly indeterminate, and a stress will help them as well.
And the indeterminate part is also why we don't see much lentils and chickpeas on irrigation.
Yes, we do see them growing under irrigation, but they don't turn the pivots on. After kind of July 1st, it's leave the pivots off and, use the moisture just to get them going. So it's not a full irrigation, but they have been growing there.
Hey, Kara's got a question here. What are you seeing for diseases on faba beans this year?
Good question. So faba beans, we saw early on a lot of stemphillium. Typically with faba beans, we expect to see more chocolate spot, which is a botrytis, and that's what we've been kind of watching for over the last few years since we've been growing fabas. But really the last 2 years, so last year and this year, we saw a high prevalence of stemphillium blight, which is kind of unusual, and we still don't know the impact of that disease on actual yield and quality with the faba beans. So that kind of came in early. Then as the season progressed, so we hit sort of later July and August, we did see some chocolate spot coming in. The botrytis did come in some of the fields, and we saw the typical chocolate spot, which is the small, tiny, kind of like a splattering of chocolate that goes on the leaves in some of the fields. And with the hot, dry weather, we really didn't see a heavy infestation of disease in the fabas. We did see the fabas shutting down really quickly, and I think a lot of that was related to, we have faba beans that have this huge biomass, and when you have really hot conditions and dry conditions, they're transpiring a lot, and if there's not enough moisture to kind of keep that plant fully watered, I guess you could say, then they can start to shut down. And I think we've seen that happening with the faba beans, where it may have looked like disease came in and kind of shut them down, but I think it was a lot of just the natural progression when they ran out of water and shut themselves down. So
what is stemphillium?
Stemphillium is a fungus that comes in and can cause blights. We see it in lentils. We are now seeing it in faba beans. The unfortunate thing is that we don't have fungicides that are registered to control stemphillium, so we don't really know what actually has activity on stemphillium. So when guys are out spraying fungicides in faba beans, they're using products that are registered for use in faba beans that have been tested on ascochyta or botrytis or sclerotinia, and they're hoping that it would get the stemphillium as well. So, I think that's one avenue that we can explore a little bit more to get some of these products registered for that disease.
Similar to soybeans, as we see more and more fabas grown, are we seeing more and more diseases pop up with every progressing year, or not yet?
Well, we're learning. So, the more that we're investigating, the more things that we're finding and that we're able to identify. This time last year, we had no idea what the spots were on the leaves in the faba beans, where this year we actually sent in samples to get it positively identified. So we can now say, okay, when we see this symptom, it's more related to a stemphillium. When we see this other symptom, it's more related to chocolate spots. So the more you grow a crop, yes, there's more that you definitely learn. And in some cases, it looks like you're bringing in also, or there's more pests showing up, but it's just that you're able to identify them better. You know what you're looking for.
Makes sense. This week, the week began, I think, what was it, Tuesday morning? It seems like so long ago already. Tuesday morning, cold temperatures across parts of southern Alberta, southern Saskatchewan. Any issues at all from a pulse perspective with that frost?
Definitely. Any of the late crops, so either ones that were seeded late and are still, not in the bin, or ones that are just longer maturity. So chickpeas, soybeans, faba beans, dry beans, a lot of those were still out in the fields and varying levels of maturity. So those can definitely be impacted by this frost that we had. And especially, like, I heard temperatures down to -9 in some places.
Yeah.
So that's cold enough that it's going to freeze anything that's kind of above ground, and anything that had moisture in the seed can cause some damage.
So, but how much of the crop potentially would that impact? And I know it's rough. We're guessing.
Oh
But
gosh, that it's a good question, because it's all depends on where you are and what stage your crop was on. I have heard, like soybeans, for example, I've heard some fields were definitely mature enough that they're not expecting a lot of frost damage. Yet I've actually seen photos from some agronomists where the fields were pretty green and are completely frozen. They look like my bean plants or my tomato plants in my garden. So, definitely going to see some impact on that. And same with the fava beans too. So far, a lot of the pictures I'm seeing come in aren't showing a lot of the frost damage, a slight frost damage, but fava beans are also grown more in the north, and the temperatures didn't get quite as cold in the north as they did in the south. Plus, fava beans are a little bit more frost tolerant.
Okay. You mentioned soybeans, and I can remember, I don't know what year it was. Oh, time flies. It may be like 8 years ago. I was on the SAS Pulse regional meeting tour. I think we did like five cities or 5 towns in 5 days. And I was giving a quick little presentation on social media, why Twitter was a good place to be. And I remember we stopped in, was it Swift Current, where the crowd was huge. It was like soybean palooza. Everybody was asking about soybeans, even down it's like into Weyburn. I remember was one of the stops. It was that I remember that year. That was right kind of when everybody was really thinking that soybeans were really going to take off. The mood's kind of cooled a little bit based on some of the performance the last couple of years on that bean crop. Acres down substantially. Things have changed a lot here in the last couple of years.
Yeah, you're totally accurate in terms of there was a huge interest in soybeans and a lot of people trying them. And the acres have dropped off from, the high of, I think we had over 800,000 acres at one point in the province, and it kind of grown across the province. But the real challenge with the soybeans is that consistency in yield and early enough maturity. So we're seeing varieties that are getting to be where the maturity is early enough for a lot of areas in the province, but it's getting that consistent yield to make it pay, to make it economical. For most guys, they need anywhere from 35 to 45 bushels an acre on an annual basis with soybeans just to make it pay. The seed costs to put them in the ground can be expensive. But there are some guys and gals and growers in the southeast that have figured soybeans out and are more suited to the soybeans and have continued with sort of that longer term production. And right now, I think that's where they're going to continue to grow the soybeans. And then as new varieties develop that are higher yielding and more suited to the other areas of the province, we may see, more adaptation again. I know a lot of growers are looking for an alternative pulse to peas and lentils. And soybeans are a good fit because they're a non-host for Aphanomyces, so the big root rot problem. So they're attractive from that standpoint, but they are a longer season pulse crop. They need heat in July, August, September, and they need moisture. So, the Southwest is kind of out of that loop because they get the heat, but they don't get the moisture. Yeah. And then as you move further north, you get the moisture, but not the heat. So if we can get some varieties that are more suitable for our northern climate, I think that's when you'll see soybeans take off more.
Well, today on the Farmer Rapid Fire for the SiriusXM show, I talked to Warren McCutcheon. He's in Carmen, Manitoba. And one of the things that Warren and I talked about is that soybeans are kind of like what you're cheering for is counter to what you want to have happen for the rest of your crops. Right? When we think about wheat, we want it to be dry in August, right? We're trying to dry down and finish. Soybeans, we're like cheering for moisture because that's what we like. It's really kind of a difficult thing when you look at some of the other crops we're growing on the farm.
Yeah. And similar with fava beans too. Fava beans need that moisture in August as well. Same with dry beans. Like, so we do have some crops that benefit from that later season moisture, which all are counterintuitive to trying to get your peas and lentils and your wheat off. Definitely.
That's interesting, though, that it fits well into the rotation with some of the other pulse crops because it's not impacted by Aphanomyces, if I can say that properly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Question here. Kara wants to know, have you gotten any results from Aphanomyces? She's just making me say it. Tests that were sent in. And how about control options?
I didn't quite get that A word. What was that again?
Don't you start. Don't. No. You're supposed to be on the same side as the host.
Yeah, so in terms of the Aphanomyces and results from soil tests this year, was that what the question was? Sorry, I got sidetracked.
She wants to know have oh geez, no, I'm thinking about it too much. Have you gotten any results from Aphanomyces tests that were sent in, and how about control options?
So there's so much that we're still trying to figure out with the Aphanomyces testing and evaluation and products that actually work. So we don't have any great news on that front. There are some options right now that growers can get some soil testing done this fall to help them to predict their risk for next year. So if they're trying to pick the fields that they're going to put peas or lentils on for next year, you can do a soil sample, send it to, there's about 5 different labs that do the analysis, and it'll give you an idea of the risk for Aphanomyces, so you know kind of before you plant the crop whether it's a good idea or not. So that's one step that you can do, and those tests are available. Okay. In terms of control options, we don't have a lot of control options right now. In fact, very few. There's 2 seed treatments that are registered for suppression of Aphanomyces, and that's the Antigo and Rancona Trio that is just coming out. So there's 2 seed treatments that you can use for that early season suppression, but during the growing season, there is really nothing that you can apply that's going to move down into those roots to give you protection from the Aphanomyces. There's a lot of research going on with it, and some of the results are suggesting, managing your nutrition of your pulse crops is another aspect that can help you to protect some of that yield loss. So making sure you have decent levels of phosphorus, potash, and sulfur is something that you can also plan for next year going forward.
Is it aggressive in new strains? Like, that's one of the issues that we chase in Club Root is that there's always new strains coming up and it mutates, and I'm probably not using the right words, but how about in this case?
Now you're going to make me try and remember what I was supposed to learn from our pathologists that are working in this space.
This is payback. This is payback. Yeah. You were making fun of me earlier.
Yeah. But if I remember right, there's 4 different sort of pathotypes that have been identified with the Aphanomyces, and the one that we have mostly here in Western Canada is the aggressive one. So it is an aggressive strain, I guess you can say, and that's part of the problem is when it's there, it's very aggressive. When it's there in combination with fusarium, it's like dynamite, and it's very hard to get rid of because the oospores, which are the long-lived resting spores, kind of like club root spores, right? They stay alive in the soil and can live for 10 to 20 years possibly. We don't even know the length of time that they can live in the soil. So once you have those fields that are heavily infected, it's really a matter of giving it time for those levels to come down. So there's research being done looking at things, practices that could impact those levels. So looking at sort of cover crops or what crops in rotation might help to bring down those oospore numbers over time. So there's some work in the literature that, mustard species, possibly oats, have an impact on the oospore levels, but that hasn't really been tested out in the field in Western Canada. And there's a project underway that is evaluating that. So it'll take some time, obviously, before we'll get the results of that, but hopefully that can shed some light on some things.
That would be interesting if seeding like a cover crop of like oats just to get some hair on the ground. If that had an that'd be a I don't know, cheap cheap option, maybe not the best way to phrase that, but that would be a really, really cool option because there's obviously some good agronomic benefits having some more roots in the soil there too.
Yeah, anytime we can use our existing crops to the benefit of our rotations, would be awesome. I know the literature with the mustard and the oats, what they're suggesting it does is that the oat biomass, as it breaks down, stimulates the oospores to germinate. And so they germinate and they're looking for that pulse crop to infect, but without the pulse crop there, those oospores then die. So, there is some scientific backing to the theory that they could help with reducing those numbers, and it just is a matter of time before we have the results from those tests.
How wide of a swath does it cut across the pulse acres?
Root rots and Aphanomyces?
Yeah.
It's across Western Canada, so everywhere from Manitoba to BC. There isn't an area that has not shown some level of Aphanomyces.
Really?
Yeah. So it's widespread. It's different from clubroot. Clubroot kind of started in a central area and then kind of is spread out from there, where Aphanomyces has been found fairly evenly across Western Canada, which really suggests that it's been here a long time. We just haven't detected it, and it's likely that it's native to our soils. And the fact that we've been growing peas and lentils for 20 to 30 years now in rotation, the more times you grow it up, the more times you have a pea or a lentil in a rotation means the more that you're selecting for that disease. And you combine that with wet years, of which the last kind of 10 years has been sort of wetter and drier cycles. So every second year seems to be a wetter year. It really stimulates the level of infection from that pathogen. And the fact that now we can actually identify, we know what we're looking for, helps us to be able to detect it. So it's been around here for a while. The first detection was in 2012. Since then, they've done a lot of survey work across Western Canada that really demonstrated that it is fairly widespread, and rotation is key.
Yeah, I know one of the things you want to talk about was planning for next year. 2020, I think, in some respects, can end any time soon. What are some of the things we've got to think about when planning for next year's crop?
Well, the big thing is the root rot situation, and planning those pea and lentil acres, figuring out where the best field on your farm is going to be for putting those crops in. So, looking at rotation, there's a lot of talk about moving to a 6, 8, 10-year rotation between peas and lentils, peas or lentils. And I know a lot of lentils are on a 2-year rotation, so even moving to a 4-year rotation would be helpful. So rotation is one aspect, but also going back through those field histories and identifying what fields had peas or lentils on them last and what the environment was. So we know from this year, a lot of the root rotted fields were lentils or peas in 2016. 2016 was a wet year, which meant the root rot, the Aphanomyces, had the ability to really, start increasing in the levels that were there. And then 4 years later, when we're planting peas and lentils back into those fields, and there's a high level of oospores and the environment cooperates, then it just becomes, running rampant within those fields. So knowing your field history, knowing what the environment was the last time those peas were growing or lentils, how many times you've grown it in the past, and then doing a soil test, just confirming whether your field is at high risk for the Aphanomyces in particular going forward would help with the root rots.
So what if 2016 had been a dry year? Then what would be my consideration?
If 2016 had been a dry yedo then we wouldn't have seen those fields as bad as what they were this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you remember what 17 was like then?
17. It's from what I remember, it's the even years seem to have been wetter. So 2012, 2014, 2016. Now I don't remember 2018, which is really weird because that's the most recent one. But in the past, those kind of even years seem to be wetter for a lot of the province. There's obviously areas where that doesn't fall within the right thing. And you can check Environment Canada on their Drought Watch website has the maps, and you can select the year and select the months, and it'll give you a good map on whether you're above average rainfall or below average to give an indication of which years in your area you should be watching out for.
This is why keeping records, like obviously you can go back and see what some of the weather was. That's easy, but particular to your fields, right? This is where
Yes.
records really pay off, and they make some sense as we're trying to deal with diseases where we got to go back 4 or 8 or 10 years. It's, you can't remember it all on top of your head.
No, and another thing to consider is when you're going back, it's not just what was growing on that field, it's what were some of the things you remember from that field. Were there spots where there was yellowing and loss of plant and lower yield? Was there lodging that was happening? Was it a field that had a lot of lodging, which could possibly mean there was late season infection of the Phanomyces? So, it's taking those good notes and having good records, which is important.
Any other considerations for next year we need to think about?
Just starting to think of pulse acres in general. Looking for varieties and new varieties as they're coming out and being able to take advantage of some of that stuff. Doing your fertility plan, and then the biggest thing is start thinking of weed control. We have an opportunity this fall with harvest kind of coming off at a decent time to do some fall weed management and really get those fields in shape for pulses come next year.
Peter Johnson and I talked about this yesterday on the show about how, we focus so much on, say, winter cereals, where, hey, you know what, if you get your jump on winter cereals, you get a portion of your acres into winter cereals, you're really helping yourself out in the spring. The same goes for fall weed control. But even better in this case is it's actually on certain weeds way more effective to be spraying in the fall time.
Yes, you have an opportunity to control a lot of those winter annuals. So getting them when they're small enough, doing a good job of controlling them so that in the spring you don't have these 4-inch, 5-inch, 6-inch weeds that are, ready to really take off and bolt. You're dealing with a cleaner field in the spring, so it just takes some of the pressure off a lot of weed control.
Yeah.
Perennial weeds are another one, like doing some fall management of some of the perennials. Depending on how affected by the frost they were, fall now into September is a good time to look at, Canada thistles, quackgrass, perennial sow thistles, some weeds like that as well.
Okay. Yeah. It's because if there's one thing that pulses are kind of notorious for, it's weed control in crop. So the more we can take care of the weeds out of crop in prep for those pulse acres, that just seems to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, definitely the more we can do ahead of time, because there is limited in-crop options in terms of weed control. The fall also gives us the option to put down a lot of those pre-emergence herbicides, so those residual ones that then activate and can be effective going into the crop season.
Okay, cool. Yeah, makes sense. What about, I know you want to talk about harvest management, particularly with fava beans. You're getting questions from growers.
Yeah, I was getting a lot of questions kind of prior to the frost more so than after here in the last couple of days. But, harvest management with fava beans when they're coming in fairly quickly, trying to make that decision about whether you need a harvest aid. If you do, what is the best product? And, it all depends on the individual field and situation. It doesn't matter what product you're looking at applying, you need it to be that 30% moisture to minimize the impact of residues on the harvested grain. And so, the three main products that are registered in fava beans are glyphosate, heat, and diquat, so Reglone. And choosing which product depends on your field situation. If you have a lot of perennial weeds in the crop, you might want to be using something that has glyphosate in it. If you're just looking for quick dry down, then your Reglone can be a good fit for that.
This is on fava beans, not lentils. There's the pre-harvest restrictions are different on the different crops.
They are different, but it's that 30% moisture in pretty much all crops, because 30% represents physiological maturity. So that's when the crop is no longer sort of taking up that moisture. The seeds are no longer forming. They're dried down to a good moisture level so that you don't have to worry about the residues from, say, a glyphosate application actually moving through the plant and going into the seed, which can then impact your marketability. So that's the big thing, and then why that 30% is important.
Earlier this week, we had on Brian Lung from PAMI, and we were talking about harvest losses. And of course, when we talk about harvest losses, a lot of times we talk about canola and the amount of canola that potentially gets thrown out the back of the combine. We don't talk about that in pulses as much, obviously, because the seed is bigger. But combine, harvest management is important, especially when it comes to a crop like, I think of like field peas. Trying to prevent cracking and things like that, which can really, really hurt you in terms of some of your sample grading. It's important to make sure that you're trying to get the cleanest sample you possibly can.
Yeah, there's a lot of harvest management that goes along with pulses, and everything from trying to get as much of the seed actually into the combine. So, you're having to use a lot of low cutting. Most of our pulses now are straight cut. So you're going in with a straight cut combine and trying to pick as much of that as close to the ground as possible. So trying to minimize the amount of dirt you're putting in, maximizing the amount of seed that's going into the combine. And then as it goes through the combine and into the truck and into the bins, obviously watching your mechanical damage. So you don't want to have the rotors at too high a speed. You don't want to be running them through augers really fast and kind of half empty so that you can cause some cracking. Because with the thin seed coats on a lot of our pulses, the mechanical damage is one of the biggest risks that we have. We do still see combine losses. Unlike canola, where a lot of the losses come out the back of the combine, with pulses, it's more the shatter on the front of the combine. So trying to minimize that and maximize the amount that gets into your hopper is important.
Yeah, like straight cutting field peas is much easier than lentils. And I remember 1 week on the Farm Rapid Fire, we asked farmers, are lentils the crop you swear at the most? Based on how close you have to combine to the ground, it can be quite a challenge on some, especially in a drier year.
You say that about the difference between peas and lentils, and I have some definite growers that would argue with you about that.
Really?
Oh yeah, peas can be worse than lentils in some cases because they can go flat on the ground.
Oh.
You get some heavy rains or heavy wind, or you get the root rots that come in and the stem almost rots off and the whole field goes completely flat. We've had to combine on our farm when we were still farming, and that is a real pain in the butt because you can only pick it up going one direction, and it's hard on equipment, really hard on equipment. And lentils can be the same way, right? They're fairly short, so you've got to cut close to the ground, and with pulses, that's one of the biggest challenges, definitely, is the harvestability.
Yeah. One of my craziest harvest memories with peas was one time we had a combine fire in a standing pea crop. It was super dry, and also standing pea stubble that's mature, very flammable.
Mm-hmm.
It could be. And we had a number of combine fires this fall all over the place. So it's glad we're kind of past that part of the season.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of the fires going on as well.
Yeah. Kara says, Shaun and I are from southern Alberta. We don't know what heavy rains are, thus lentils. Yeah, exactly. So, Sherrilyn, any other last-minute tips for listeners and viewers out there in terms of things to be thinking about here at harvest time or in regards to next year?
Well, I think just harvest time, is trying to get those crops off in the best quality, best shape that you can, being efficient in terms of getting them off as quick as you can into the bin and then get them cooled. Pulses have pretty good long-term storage as long as you can get the temperatures down, so making sure they're going in the bin cooled. Or if they have been harvested already and were harvested in that heat in August, run some air through them and just get those temperatures dropped so they can be stored for a long time. Then as we're moving into switching gears and starting to think about next year, look at your fields, look at your weed spectrums, do some weed control if needed, and if you have the ability or interest in doing some of the fall or getting ready for spring by putting some pre-emergence products down, I guess this fall as well. Those are kind of some big things. And then with peas and lentils, the big thing is just really, really taking some time to look at your rotations, look at the risks with the root rots, and try and minimize the impact next year. Now, we could have a dry year next year and not have a problem with root rots. We've definitely had years like that, but we know from past experience that if you can pick the right field, if you can give those zoospores some time to die down, pick those fields that have been out of peas or lentils a little bit longer, tends to do better.
Got a question here from Dieter. We kind of hit on this a little bit, but we'll just quickly sneak back to it. Dieter's in Manitoba, but speaking from Western Canadian perspective, with new higher yielding soybean varieties entering the marketplace, where do you see soybean acres going? What do you think?
That's a good question, and Manitoba is so different from Saskatchewan, and is more similar to like that really southeastern part of Saskatchewan and the southwestern part of Manitoba are more similar, and that's completely different from the Red River Valley area. So some of these high-yielding soybeans tend to be more suited to that Red River Valley area. And anytime you can get some higher-yielding soybeans, that's more dollars in growers' pockets and more attractive for growing soybeans. If they're the earlier maturing ones and have increased their yield for suitability in that western Manitoba, southeastern Saskatchewan, there could be some guys getting back into them and trying them again. So I think soybeans are here to stay, and there's definitely opportunity to grow those acres as we see varieties become more adaptable and higher yielding, definitely.
Yeah, well, yesterday we were talking about how there could be a record soybean yield this year in Ontario, just over 53 bushels an acre. And one of the reasons that we discussed about why of that is, farming practices and things like that, but it's also genetics, and there's a lot more focus on some of the lower heat unit ranges. Well, as that continues to happen, and when you have a potential for, like Monsanto had predicted, 6 to 8 million acres of beans across Western Canada, people are going to pay attention to that heat unit range. So it's just going to take a little bit longer, I think, than maybe we first recognized for beans to take more of a hold.
Yeah. We've had a few years where we had the longer growing seasons, and we're able to get away with some of those longer season varieties. But the reality is that, we are a shorter season in Western Canada for the most part, other than the Red River Valley area. So we've got to focus on those shorter heat unit varieties, which take time to come to market.
Hey, Lindsay just reminded me, what about that mystery disease in chickpeas?
God, you had to bring that up.
I'm sorry.
Yes, it is. It still remains to be a mystery. We've done a lot of testing. And, the results that came back from the testing, we looked at some herbicide residues, we looked at nutrient levels, we looked at, I think there was 18 different diseases and viruses, and nothing is jumping out at us as that's the cause. So it's been about kind of ruling things out. We were hoping to find kind of the needle in the haystack, but there isn't that jumping out at us yet. Seems to be somewhat impacted definitely by environment, going from dry conditions to getting some moisture and at flowering time. We know chickpeas, when it comes to flowering, I have one agronomist that calls them the teenage years when they hit flowering, because they seem to lose a bit of their resistance and they kind of go a little bit wonky in terms of their responses to things, more sensitivity, all that kind of stuff. Kind of that teenage stuff, right? They're more sensitive. They're hormonal. You can't really predict what they're going to do. So all that kind of was happening at that same time. So, environment is likely playing a role. If there's a disease that's involved, we're still working on what that could be. Could be some wilts, some root rot, or some vascular wilts that in combination with drier conditions is causing some issues. So we're still investigating. We've got a couple more tests to run on them, and then we're going to do some soil samples this fall to look at nematodes and some other things, just to kind of do the full gamut of testing to see if there's something that can really jump out at us.
Pulses are really cool to me because if you look at other crops, like let's corn or soybeans or wheat, a lot of times we look to other areas to learn from, especially in soybeans and corn. But pulses are an example of where other areas like Montana, North Dakota, Idaho, they look to us and our knowledge on these crops. I think it's really, really such a cool story.
It is, and it's nice because we try to work quite closely with the people in North Dakota, Montana, and even Washington, because there's a lot of things that we can learn from each other and our experiences. So, there's a lot of sharing of information.
Yeah, awesome stuff. Hey, Sherrilyn, I really appreciate you joining us here today. It's been great to focus in and talk about pulses. You're such a great source of knowledge on this topic, and I want to thank you very much.
Well, thank you for having me. I always like talking about pulses.
Perfect stuff. Hey, I want to remind everybody to please remember to tune in to RealAg Radio today on Rural Radio 147, 4:30 Eastern, 2:30 Mountain. Got the Farmer Rapid Fire. We're talking to farmers across the country. Find out how they're making out in their fields and in their barns. We've got some dairy farmers this week, some cash croppers from across the country. It's going to be a lot of fun, provide a lot of insight. And I also have a special tribute to a listener of RealAg Radio who passed over the weekend too that I wanted to give a special acknowledgement to as well. So that's Rural Radio 147, or you can catch the podcast at realagradio.com. Thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers everybody.